I want to talk about some biblical touch points today that would help the church find warrant and resources for engaging in society and politics today. Why don't we start at the beginning, where Adam and Eve are given the mandate to rule and subdue the earth, to tend and care for the garden, to govern that which God has created. Here we have the initial picture of governance, of government. We are given that mandate, that command from God, to take what is there, the resources that are there, and manage them well. And in some ways, the best example of that, moving on into Genesis, comes in the story of Joseph. As we find him in prison in the land of Egypt, God gives him a dream about an upcoming famine. And somehow he ends up in the upper echelons of government in Egypt, and he's able to prepare a whole country for that upcoming famine. He takes them through that famine, stewards the resources well, even helping neighbouring nations to make it through. What a picture of followers of God in government. A little bit further on into the story, we encounter God's people who are looking over their shoulder in a moment of disgruntled uncertainty. We want a king like some of these neighbouring nations, they say amongst themselves, and the prophet Samuel pulling his hair out, asking forgiveness from God on behalf of the people. Can you believe this people? And God says, yeah, I know, but let them have what they want. Let's let this play. I'll weave it into my plans nonetheless. And so we then encounter the kings of Saul, David and Solomon. Before then, the kingdom splits into two. We've got the northern and the southern kingdom. We've got all these kings and one queen at one point. And the plethora of kings, and most of them do a really poor job under God to try and govern well. But there is something there in some of the kings of the social reformers where they were able to turn away from idolatry, to do justice, that we could attend to in some of our preaching and some of our practice today. Albeit we need to be aware of the theocracy under which they lived, which doesn't apply to today as we live in the United Kingdom or in Scotland. Moving on, we must talk about exile, where the prophetic tradition must be attended to, and at times the church needs to live in that prophetic role, a spur, a corrective to injustice and evil around about, where the brave thing is said from the margins to the powers, to let them know that they are off track, they are off beam, that they are exploiting the people. And yet, within exile, we come across another picture of God saying to his people, plant gardens, build houses, marry, bed into where you are even though you're in exile and you're far from your temple. Make life where you are. Make the best of the situation you're in. A couple of great exemplars of living overseas away from their country. We see Nehemiah, who was a trusted aide, who was able to whisper up close to his king, the cupbearer, who developed such a good relationship with his king that the king allowed Nehemiah to lead his people back to the promised land and start rebuilding Jerusalem. An amazing moment. In quite a different picture, we come across Esther, who, getting intel from her uncle, is able to save God's people from a slaughter. That's a powerful moment in the history of God's people. And then we see Daniel as well, who seems to walk an incredible tightrope of knowing when to work in harmony with Babylonian culture, when to work against it, to be brave in situations where he is personally at threat, and yet maintains faithful to God, is able to govern, bring wisdom, bring spiritual insight at the highest levels of government. We enter the Christmas story, and politics is present there too. God himself comes to earth. The Father sends the Son to become a human being And at that moment, Herod kills numerous young boys, terrified, paranoid that his kingship is under threat because a new king has arrived on the scene. The politics of Christmas. And Jesus, of course, draws from the prophetic tradition we discussed earlier, where he's challenging injustices, he is being brave, he in righteous anger speaks up and challenges the status quo of the day. And that is in keeping with, of course, John the Baptist, who does the same and ends up having his head on the platter because he challenges the sexual life of King Herod at that time. We're given an incredible insight as Jesus, in some form of culmination, is arrested and is able to talk with Pilate, is able to have this back and forward, and is able to spin a different reality for Pilate, to say to him, do you know, you even wouldn't have the power to do this if it weren't given from a greater authority. Look around you. And in that moment of angst, that moment where salvation was wrought on the outskirts of that city, a political execution takes place, which atones for the sins of the whole world. And one of the men responsible for meting out that punishment, that justice, a Roman centurion, looks up and realizes this was the Son of God. Somebody's nailed up there a plaque saying, "You are the King of the Jews." That is what you are. A political moment. And as Jesus is resurrected, as he is ascended, as the Spirit is sent, the latter half of the book of Acts provides us a wonderful case study for a public faith engaging the powers. As Paul meets with tribunals and courtrooms and meeting with authorities all over the Roman Empire, he provides us an example after example of how to interact with those in ruling authority. It's funny how it's overlooked for the front half of Acts. That latter half of Acts provides a wealth of warrant for us to engage in society today. And of course, the same man in his letters writes to us some amazing things about actually working with the powers that be, working with the governing authorities. The classic one, of course, is in Romans 13, where he says, yes, they are in authority, but they are under the authority of an ascended Jesus, who gives them their existence. And if we work in harmony with them, not giving them an excuse to mete out punishment and justice because we behave badly, we will be living out an ethic of Christ in that moment. That's why he says later on in a letter in Timothy, live a quiet and peaceable life, so don't give them an excuse to hammer on us. Let's work with the government, work quietly, live quietly in harmony with them. At some points in our existence, that is the moment, the cultural moment we're in. Those are the passages we draw from. Yeah, Peter himself says it later on as he speaks to the Jewish Christians scattered throughout the Greco-Roman world. Look, we need to honor the emperor, the very one who is ultimately responsible for Jesus, who was executed on a hill. And then, as somewhat of a completion of the biblical story, we are entered to a tale of two cities. A story of two kinds of politics. On the one hand, in the book of Revelation, there is a city, a system, an empire of slaughter, of blood, of idolatry, of immorality, Babylon. And God calls his people, come out of her, my people, to these 7 churches who Revelation is written to. Come out of her, my people. Not literally leave the Roman Empire, but live a different kind of politics, a different kind of life in the midst of all that is going on round about. Live a life of hope, of forgiveness, of sacrifice, of martyrdom even. Marked by a different city, a different system. A city that's going to come one day out of heaven from God, the New Jerusalem. There will only be one city with one type of politics that will ultimately exist, and it is the new heavens and the new earth. Why do we do what we do? The scriptures provide a wealth of resources that provide warrant for us to engage the politics of our day, to interact with the society we live in. Let's draw upon those in our communities to make a Christian difference in our time.